She wakes up in the hospital with no memories, but when she looks into her husband's eyes, a feeling of danger takes over. Alice wakes up without memory, trapped in a past she cannot recall. Beside her, Henry, her husband, seems like the perfect man, but why does she feel so uncomfortable with his touch? Fragments of a terrible accident begin to invade her mind, bringing doubts that could change everything. Alice woke slowly, as if she were being pulled from a confusing dream. When she opened her eyes, she was greeted by a room entirely white and flooded with artificial lights. The hum of machines and the strong smell of disinfectant were oppressive, making her feel nauseous. Her body felt strange, heavy, and disconnected, as if she couldn't fully control it. When she tried to move, she realized she was connected to tubes and wires. The feeling of helplessness alarmed her. Her arms trembled with weakness, and an intense pain pounded in her head. With each blink, the room seemed brighter, but her mind remained foggy, as if something was blocking her thoughts. She tried to remember where she was or what had happened, but everything was blank. No memories, no connection. Just the present, the here and now. A gentle touch on her hand pulled her out of her confusion. She slowly turned her head to see a man beside her, with deep, tired brown eyes. He held her hand with a tenderness that seemed almost reverent. "Alice!" His voice was soft, but there was a faint tremor. "Thank God you woke up." Alice frowned, confused. The name sounded familiar but distant at the same time, like it belonged to someone else. She tried to respond, but her throat was dry and rough. She couldn't produce a sound. The man, noticing her effort, leaned in a little closer. "Don't try to speak, dear." He smiled, though the exhaustion on his face was evident. "I'm Henry, your husband. You've been in a coma for weeks." He hesitated for a moment, as if reliving the pain of that time. "I was so afraid of losing you." The word husband echoed in her mind but didn't trigger any memory. "Coma?" she wondered, feeling even more disconnected from reality. Henry's words hit her like an avalanche of information that didn't make sense. How could she not remember her own husband? And what had happened for her to be there, stuck in that bed with no memories? Finally, she managed to murmur, her voice hoarse and weak, "I don't remember anything." Henry's expression filled with sadness. He squeezed her hand, but, strangely, Alice felt uncomfortable with his touch. Something inside her screamed that something was wrong. It was an inexplicable but real feeling. The door to the room opened, and a nurse walked in with a gentle smile. She began adjusting the monitors next to Alice's bed. "Hello, dear," said the nurse in a comforting tone. "It's good that you woke up. You suffered a terrible car accident, but you're recovering well. There were moments when we thought you wouldn't come back, but look at you, here you are." Alice nodded, but her mind was far away. The words accident and coma floated in her head, but nothing seemed to fit. The nurse continued talking about her recovery, but Alice barely listened. She was focused on the uneasy feeling she couldn't shake. Something, or someone, was out of place. When she looked back at Henry, the feeling of distrust returned with full force. He seemed familiar, yet at the same time he was a complete stranger. And that disturbed her deeply. The days that followed were long and exhausting. Alice's physical recovery progressed slowly, while the doctors celebrated each small progress, a short walk here, a gain of strength there. But for Alice, it seemed insignificant compared to her mental struggle. The lack of memories was devastating. She felt disconnected from herself and the world around her. Henry was always around. He was attentive, bringing flowers, books, and photos that were supposed to help her remember who she was and, more importantly, who they were together. Henry talked about the life they had before the accident, describing trips they had taken, birthdays celebrated, and quiet moments of intimacy. But for Alice, every word felt like a story told by a stranger. She listened intently, but nothing felt real. The most disturbing thing, however, was the discomfort that grew inside her whenever Henry was around. There was something in his gestures, in his tone of voice, that made her uneasy. It was hard to explain, but each time he touched her or looked at her, she felt an urge to pull away. One particularly quiet morning, As Henry arranged some flowers beside the bed, Alice decided to confront this feeling. "Henry," she began, her voice firmer than she expected. He turned immediately, with a look of expectation and concern. "Yes, dear? What is it?" He came closer, as if wanting to be nearer to hear her better. Alice hesitated for a moment but knew she had to say something. I know you're trying your best to help me, but," she took a deep breath, "I don't feel comfortable with you. I don't know why, but every time you're near, I feel strange." Henry's expression shifted from expectation to pain in seconds. He seemed to struggle to find a response. "I understand, Alice," he said softly, lowering his head. "This must be very hard for you." He paused, his hands trembling. "Seeing you like this, without remembering anything, it's devastating." He looked her directly in the eyes, his voice laden with emotion. "But I'm here. I'm by your side, and we'll get through this together." Alice wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that promise of support, but something inside her simply wouldn't allow it. A deep instinct screamed that she was living a lie, though she couldn't prove it. Every attempt Henry made to get closer seemed like a reminder that something was profoundly wrong. As the days passed, she began to question more about what might be hidden, and even though there was no concrete evidence, the feeling that there was more behind Henry's caring and devoted facade was something she couldn't ignore. For now, however, Alice kept these suspicions to herself. Perhaps it was just the trauma, as Henry and the doctor suggested, or maybe it was something much more sinister. One morning, while Alice was slowly walking through the hospital corridors, supported by a nurse, a flash of memory hit her so hard that it nearly caused her legs to give out. She grabbed the nurse's arm, her eyes wide and gasping for breath. "Are you okay?" asked the nurse, concerned. Alice shook her head, trying to control the panic. "Yes, just a dizziness," she lied, though she knew it was more than that. Her mind was in turmoil. She had seen something, felt something. A car. She was behind the wheel, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The screeching sound of tires skidding, and her heart racing with a fear that felt too real to be just a distant memory. What was that? She whispered to herself, staring at the floor as she tried to understand what had just happened. The image returned to her mind, driving at high speed on a wet road. Fear consumed her. And then, another image emerged, another car, very close, following her closely. She could feel the threatening presence of that car behind her. And, at that moment, her heart nearly stopped when she recognized the driver's face. Henry. Alice stumbled slightly, but the nurse caught her, offering support. "Shall we go back to the room? You look tired." "Yes, that might be best." Alice nodded, trying to process what that memory meant. Back in the room, she sat on the bed, her hands trembling. She remembered Henry in the car behind her, chasing her. And then the impact, the accident. Her heart raced, and she felt a mixture of panic and clarity at the same time. Henry had been there. He wasn't just the caring husband by her bedside. He was involved in the accident. She didn't know what to do with that information. She couldn't confront him yet. She needed more. She didn't know how far he would go to protect whatever he was hiding. Alice decided then that she would have to pretend, keep Henry believing that she remembered nothing. At least for now. It was the only way to ensure her own safety. As she watched the door to the room, Alice knew her life was about to change. Now, more than ever, she needed to be careful. After all, the pieces were beginning to fit together, and the truth, as frightening as it was finally emerging. Alice knew she couldn't continue on this journey alone. Every time Henry left to discuss medical matters or handle some issue, the tension in her body would momentarily ease. It was during one of those absences that Mark appeared. As soon as he entered the room, a feeling of safety and familiarity washed over her, something she hadn't felt since she woke up. Mark was an old friend, someone who had been part of her life before Henry. When Alice saw him, her eyes filled with tears, and she realized that, even without memories, something inside her trusted him immediately. He wasn't like Henry, his presence brought peace. "Alice!" Mark exclaimed, smiling as he walked towards her. "When I heard about your accident, I came as quickly as I could. How are you?" Alice smiled for the first time in weeks. "I'm okay. I think, at least physically. She hesitated for a moment, but knew she couldn't miss this opportunity. She needed to trust someone. Mark, there's something I need to tell you. Mark sat down in the chair beside the bed, his expression now more serious. Of course, Alice. What's going on? Alice looked around, as if fearing that someone might be listening, then lowered her voice. I've started having memory flashes. From the accident. She took a deep breath, preparing for the next part. And Henry was there. He was following me that night. Mark's eyes widened in shock. Henry? What are you saying? Alice bit her lip, fighting back tears. I don't remember everything, but what I saw, he was following me, Mark. I was running away from him. Mark was silent for a few seconds, processing what she had just said. Then, with a determined expression, he spoke. Alice, this is serious. You need to go to the police. I know, but I can't yet. Alice's voice was urgent. I need proof. Henry is clever, and I don't know how far he would go to keep this hidden. She looked at Mark with desperation in her eyes. I need your help. Mark nodded, his expression resolute. Of course I'll help you. We'll find out what's going on. With Mark's help, Alice began to formulate a plan. Henry couldn't suspect that her memories were returning. She would have to pretend, deceive him until she was sure she could act safely. In the days that followed, while Henry continued to visit her with his devoted smile and stories of a past she couldn't remember, Alice watched him closely, looking for any sign that he was hiding more than she already knew. Mark began to investigate discreetly, searching for information about Henry that might confirm Alice's suspicions. The challenge was immense and the danger imminent. But now, with the help of someone she could trust, Alice felt a bit safer. She knew the road to the truth would be long, but she was willing to face it step by step. The weeks that followed were filled with secrets and revelations. Mark, with his connections in the legal world and his determination to help Alice, managed to uncover what she feared. Henry was involved in something much bigger than just an emotional betrayal. The first sign that Alice's suspicions were real came through financial transactions. Mark, with his skill at accessing confidential records, found large withdrawals from Henry's accounts, amounts that seemed to be used for something shady. Alice, this is disturbing, Mark said, handing her a set of documents. He's embezzling money. And there's more, Mark paused, preparing her for what was coming next. He was preparing contracts to take full control of your companies while you were in a coma. Alice's stomach churned as she read the evidence. Henry, the man who claimed to love her, wasn't just betraying her trust but also planning to steal from her. But what she discovered next was even more devastating. Mark managed to trace messages and phone records between Henry and a woman, revealing an extramarital affair. The messages were clear. Henry and his mistress were planning to be together as soon as Alice was out of the way. The cold expression in the words exchanged between them made Alice shudder. The accident hadn't just been a tragedy, it was an attempt to get rid of her. He tried to kill me, Alice whispered, her eyes fixed on the messages, the truth finally becoming fully clear. Mark nodded, the concern on his face evident. We need to go to the police now, Alice. We have enough evidence. He cannot go unpunished. Alice, though frightened, knew it was the right thing to do. Henry was dangerous, and now that she knew too much, there was no choice but to act before he did something worse. With Mark's help, they gathered all the evidence and went to the police. When Henry was arrested on charges of attempted murder and fraud, Alice finally felt the weight she had carried for weeks lift. She was free of Henry and the shadow of danger that had hung over her life since the accident. But at the same time, she knew she still had a long road to recovery ahead. With Henry behind bars, Alice was finally able to begin rebuilding her life. The sense of freedom, after weeks of tension and fear, was indescribable. Yet, the emotional scars were deep, and the path to healing would be long. Mark stayed by her side throughout the process, being a pillar of support when she needed it most. Weeks passed, and what started as a friendship and investigative partnership soon blossomed into something more. Alice and Mark grew even closer, and over time, the affection between them developed into something deeper. At first, Alice hesitated. After everything she had been through, falling in love again was the last thing she expected. But Mark was different. He had been by her side, not as a savior, but as someone who believed in her, who supported her unconditionally. "You've always been here for me," Alice said one day, as they walked through a park, the fresh morning air wrapped in a tranquil silence. "I don't know how I would have done this without you." Mark stopped walking and turned to her, his eyes shining with emotion. "Alice, I didn't do anything you weren't already ready to do. You're stronger than you realize." He smiled, but there was something more in his gaze, something Alice hadn't noticed until then. "And I fell in love with that strength." Alice felt her heart race. She knew deep down that she felt the same way. "I fell in love with you too, Mark." The statement was simple but filled with sincerity. From that moment on, Alice knew she was finally ready to start over. With Mark by her side, the future seemed promising, even though the path had been filled with pain and uncertainties. Together, they decided to take a trip, something Alice had always wanted to do but never had the courage. And during that trip, on an isolated beach at sunset, Alice finally found the peace she had been searching for. She looked at Mark beside her and smiled, feeling, for the first time in a long time, whole. "Thank you for being by my side," she said, her voice soft and calm. Mark squeezed her hand affectionately. "I'll always be here, Alice, for whatever comes." Now, Alice knew that with Mark by her side, she could face anything, and the future, as uncertain as it might be, was full of new possibilities.